Welcome to the What Do You Do podcast, where I sit down and speak with professionals having honest conversations about their careers, how they got into them, and advice for those looking to follow a similar path. But most of all, telling you, the listeners, what it's really like to do that job. Well, Emily, welcome to the What Do You Do podcast. It's an absolute delight to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Emily, I'm really keen to get into the nitty gritty of who you are, your background, and dive into the weaves and pivots that you take in your career so others can, learn from your experience. So, obviously, you started out in a little bit more of a corporate background, starting at Amex, and you were there for nearly a good 9 years, and then pivoted to become self-employed. So, really keen to dive into that all throughout this podcast. So, to get us started, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how would you describe what you do for a living to someone who isn't in your field or industry?
Juicy question. So I'm Emily. I run a business called EBC, and the business has had multiple pivots over the last kind of 4 or 5 years, and I can definitely go into that in a bit more detail. What we do now is empower leaders and teams to leverage diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's all around driving high performing teams. So we work with many companies and organisations, both across private sector, public sector. We do some work in the charity sphere as well, and we run lots of leadership programs, workshops with teams, one-to-one career and leadership coaching, and then we also have kind of an advisory and consultancy arm where we do a lot of work around creating people first cultures and things around kind of how can you drive more diversity, equity and inclusion within your teams, and what does that look like?
It sounds all very interesting and certainly very on topic, so very on trend with all of the things that need to be spoken about in today's workplaces. So I want to know how you got to where you are today. Talk us through the beginning of your career and I guess how you weaved into what you're doing now.
So I feel like my career has been like multiple phases, and that's a lot of the advice that I give to clients, whether that's in a one-on-one coaching perspective of actually, I think sometimes when we look at our careers, we think, okay, we have to do this for a certain amount of time. And I definitely think that although the career for life, we've come a long way to kind of move away from that, there still is that sense of you have to be in something for a long period of time. And a lot of the work that I do with clients is all around actually redefining what success means to you and how does that look like for the short term and also for the longer term, but giving yourself space to evolve and grow. So I think there's been like multiple phases within my career. And actually, if I think back to myself, when I left university, I was never the type of person that really wanted to be an entrepreneur. I think it's quite interesting, a lot of the conversations that I have with founders, I think you have people in multiple different camps, but that was never something that I set out to do. So I kind of went through the route of school to college to university, and I went to Bournemouth University and I studied business, and the real driver for me doing that was because I was good at business. There wasn't necessarily really an end game, but it was just the thing to do. And I feel like I was quite in that there wasn't a lot of thought that went into that. And I don't mean that in terms of like I wasn't ambitious and I wasn't driven, but it was kind of like the next step, the next step, the next step. So I went through university, and the next step after doing a business degree was going into a graduate scheme. And I applied for so many graduate schemes. So I graduated in 2011. Obviously, we had the financial crisis in 2008. It was still quite a ropey time to be entering the workforce. And I think I must have done like 50 plus graduate scheme applications, and they were lengthy. Like they weren't just like, oh, okay, you send your CV. They were like multiple steps. So I was getting to the point where I was like quite disillusioned and a bit like, okay, so if this isn't going to work, like what do I want to do next? And I applied for Amex and then got on, and that was a great opportunity for me. So we did lots of rotations within the grad scheme, and it really allowed me to experience different areas of the business in a real like safe space. And then again, I kind of went through the promotion. So then I was a manager, did multiple different roles there. And then that was the point where I was thinking, I'm not really sure if this is for me. So I was kind of 25, going through a bit of a kind of quarter life crisis, I think, really thinking about like, what's my purpose and what's my values? And I definitely didn't have that terminology to put to those words, but that was basically how I was feeling. And I started working with a coach to kind of unpack some of those feelings. And at this point, I wasn't even thinking about leaving. I was just thinking about, I feel like I'm stuck and I don't know why I'm stuck, because on paper, like everything looks great, you know, we're going really well, and, you know, just bought a house and was getting all of these promotions and had a really good career trajectory, but something just didn't feel right. And I would definitely encourage people to lean into that, because things might look rosy from the outside, but if you've got that feeling and you've got that stuck feeling, and again, you might not even be able to put the words or terminology or language to that, definitely follow that. And I work with a coach, and that was the first step for me to actually see this other sphere of the potential around kind of self-employment. And she was hugely aspirational. She'd left like a corporate job, moved down to the coast, and set up her coaching business. And I was like, maybe I could do that. And that was like an idea that was kind of planted at that point. And it wasn't until I was kind of 32, so that was like 7 years later, that actually that was the point where I went into that from a business perspective. But it definitely planted the seeds. And the focus that I was working with her was around like getting this promotion to a director level. And I'd kind of thought, okay, so I'm feeling this level of stuck, so maybe it's the level that I'm at, and got this director position at 27, and was hugely proud of myself because I was young. All of my peers were 10, 15 at least years older than me, mainly male, as you can imagine, in kind of financial services. And I thought, oh, I'm going to feel that real sense of achievement. And I did for a short period of time. And then all of those kind of niggles and, you know, things around like the politics and, you know, how difficult it is to get things done and how like people are treated in large organizations, that kind of rose its head. And that was the point that I was like, right, I need to do something else. And that was when I was actively looking into, well, what does that look like for me? And that's when I started to explore, actually, well, what do I like? What do I love about my current role? And every single thought process and reflection I had always came back to the people. So I loved managing a big team. I love mentoring people. You know, I spent a lot of time in my job developing people. And that wasn't necessarily the norm. We weren't necessarily like majorly gold on that. But actually, that was something that I got the best out of people, and that was the feedback that I had, and that was really what lit me up. And that's when I started exploring doing my coaching qualification, and almost like that was dipping my toes in the water to see, like, you know, do I like this? And I loved it. And that's when I started making the plans to leave the corporate world and set up my own business.
Love this. Brilliant. Well, it sounds like someone obviously inspired you, sowed the seed, and then later on down the line, you know, you kind of, I guess you're giving back a little bit as well from what you've received as well,
Yeah.
which is wonderful. So you obviously talked there about becoming a coach and getting certified. So how did that all come about? So how did you find the coaching qualification? Did you go back to the original coach that you worked with and said, can you give me some advice? Or how did that all come about?
Yeah, I went back to my original coach I worked with, and I did lots of research. And coaching is a very interesting industry because it's not regulated. So there's loads of different qualifications, and people can call themselves coaches even if they're not qualified. But it was something that was really important for me to make sure I did. So I did quite an intensive coaching qualification that required a certain amount of prep beforehand. So I think I did like 100 hours of prep and lots of almost like theory-based things, and based on learning. And then I did like a 7-day period, and that was interesting because I was working at the time. So I basically worked like solidly for like 12 days. And at the end, I was very much needing a break. But it really, although it was really hard work and we did like really long 10-hour days, and it was quite confronting because we were practicing our coaching skills, but also as well, like being the coachee as well as the coach. So it felt like a really like big processing thing that I process as well personally as well as kind of professionally. And then I've since gone on to kind of get additional qualifications and making sure that I'm kind of building up my hours. And I think the landscape is constantly changing. So making sure that I'm delivering the best that I can for my clients is really important, and kind of honing down on my niche and what that looks like. And actually, when I first became a coach, I was really focused on career and life coaching, and actually a lot of the work that I did was with direct clients and women that were looking to follow almost a bit of the same path to me, in terms of leaving a corporate job and setting up their own business or doing something a bit different. And now it has since kind of, I guess, evolved to be much more career and leadership coaching. So that's a kind of area of expertise that I focus on now.
Awesome. And so I'm eager to dive into a little bit more detail around, you mentioned obviously you went through a whole process. What did you learn from that coaching experience about yourself?
I think it was around a greater sense of self and like my drivers, what was important to me, where some of my limiting beliefs were. And I feel like a lot of the things that I explored were around, you know, my need for perfectionism. And I was and this is something that again was not solved as part of the coaching qualification, but it's something that I think I will continue to work on for the rest of my life, in terms of like how perfectionism shows up for me, which is not necessarily what we view perfectionism like. If we kind of think about the term, it's not like everything has to be perfect. For me, it's around just overworking. So I will give my all to clients, that I would give 110%. I will kick myself if I haven't done something that I feel like I should have done. I will respond to things at all hours. And so it's really important for me to make sure that I'm setting those boundaries, because I know that I can get into those frames of references. And I feel like that was the start for understanding a lot of those things. And those are things that I have to continually address on a daily basis. And I feel that with our limitations and with things that we struggle with, I don't feel there's ever like an easy solution to them. It's just having that level of awareness and continually working on them.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So can you talk us through a little bit more detail around when people come to you and they start working with you, what the scenarios are, and then what you've managed to implement or help them with?
So a lot of the work that I do now is with companies and organisations. So I might be having conversations with, so a client that I'm working with at the moment is a big UK charity, and they came to me because there was a new CEO that was promoted, and they were looking to actually redefine their vision, their mission statement, and also their values. And that was something that was with my kind of consultancy hat on, and that has been a period that I've been working with them for the last kind of 4 to 5 months, and I think that will continue for the next couple of years, because with any kind of culture change, it's huge, right? So it's about how do we measure it, how do we test and learn, how do we drive improvement. So I'm leading that and helping support the staff team through that, and making sure that we're involving stakeholders. And that's been really, really interesting, because although you wouldn't see that organization as disrupting the status quo, actually what I really love about them is they are really open to doing things completely differently, and being able to go into an organization and put forward ideas that perhaps seem quite out there or are very different to what they've already done before. That's where I really find my passion, I think, and that's where I get really excited, because actually if we continue doing what we've always done, we're always going to get the same results. And I think when we think about the pace of change, even over the last 4 years, it's been huge, right? You know, we're in a completely different world, and that continues to speed up, especially when we think about the fact that we've got like 5 different generations in the workforce at the moment, with completely different needs, completely different drivers, completely different motivators. Actually, companies are having to really like tear out the rule book, especially when you think about leadership programs and leadership training that we do a lot of work on, and that actually it's about, we can't always do what we always used to do, and being able to go in and work with different organizations and explore, okay, so what does a leader of the future look like for you as an organization, and what support do your leaders need, especially when we think about, particularly in the leadership space, there's been a huge amount of underinvestment, particularly in the pandemic, when we've had had like, you know, a really ropey economic situation. And what I've seen from organisation and companies that I'm speaking to now is they are seeing the result of that underinvestment. And that could be things through, you know, lack of employee engagement, huge big wellbeing problems. There's lots of things around actually, you know, leaders not being equipped to deal with the level of growth and the change and the uncertainty that a lot of these marketplaces are experiencing from an industry perspective, but also the rate of change within.
100%. There's so much to unpack, I swear. Like there has been so much workplace change in the last, you know, well, since COVID, to be honest, since 2020. You know, there was like the move to remote, then to hybrid, then people going back in full office again. Like as a recruiter myself, I know that there are some businesses that are, you know, really adamant of having people back into the office full time, but then they're going to have churn from the workforce then, that there's more culture changes. It's a whole thing, isn't it? It's wild. Okay, brilliant. So obviously you pivoted from being employed to self-employed. So I think a lot of people will probably think, oh, you know, how can I become a coach, or how did you navigate that particular time period specifically? You told us obviously that you just bought a house and you were at that point of, you know, you'd done all the things that you were meant to do. Did you have any concerns about not being able to pay your mortgage, for example?
I think money is the biggest preventer of us making big changes. And I say that not in a flippant way, because obviously, you know, we've all got to be aware of the fact that we're in a cost of living crisis, and you know, money is more important now than it's ever been. You think about house prices and you think about mortgages and stability. There's a lot of instability. And I definitely think, and reflecting on and having conversations, if I wasn't paid as much as I was, I probably would have left earlier. And I feel that you see that a lot with people that are in senior leadership positions, especially when the outside, you know, people are constantly reinforcing and saying, wow, you know, you've got to this great position and you've done it really quickly, and you know, you earn a good amount of money, and you know, you've got all of these kind of material things, and that's great, but sometimes that can keep you trapped. So it's just definitely something to be aware of in terms of money shouldn't be the main driver. And especially when you think about, you know, even going back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like money is a hygiene factor. It's not necessarily a motivator. Yes, we need a certain amount of money, but there's a huge amount of data about actually if you get above a certain amount, and I think it was like 60K, but that's probably gone up when you think about the cost of living crisis, that actually you aren't any more motivated. So for me, and I think this goes back to like how I work, and I'm very kind of like, I'm a planner, and that's another thing that I've had to work on, but that's another story. But for me, it was like very consciously thinking about how much money do I need in order to leave. So mine was a long process. It definitely wasn't a snap decision. So again, started working with that coach at 25, got my promotion to a director at 27. Then I fell pregnant at 29, and that was all part of the plan. And I think a big driver for me as well for leaving, as well as kind of having these niggles, was also reflecting on, I wouldn't be able to do my director position part-time. And that was really important for me when I was thinking about having a family, that for me, I didn't want my kids to be in nursery 5 days a week, and everyone is different and everyone have different decisions and different viewpoints on that. But that was something that was really important for my why, and that was a really important value for me. So everything almost was a bit of a kind of melting pot. So I then had the instability of, okay, so I was going to have a child, and I, you know, that was my first child, and I didn't know what that would be like. So for me, it was really important to make sure that I was saving a lot of money. So as I progressed throughout my corporate career and my money went up, I never gave myself a huge amount more money. So I always saved so much money. So I had a huge amount of savings. And that was one of the big kind of unlockers to, you know, me and my husband, who wasn't my husband at the time, for us buying our first house at 24. We had no family help, you know, we got a 5% mortgage. And actually that's what I've always done. So I had a huge chunk of savings behind me, and I basically gave myself a couple of years. And I think again, with these kind of decisions, sometimes people can be like, oh, I have to make it work. And I definitely had that viewpoint of, I really want to give it a good go. And I gave myself kind of 2-ish years to be like, if I can't make it work in 2 years, then I'll go back and do something else. And nothing's a life sentence. And I think that's what I would like your viewers to kind of walk away with, that sometimes we think that these are like huge jumps, but actually they're not. Like, you can always go back. And I always thought, I've got the skills, my skills haven't diminished. If I've almost got more skills when I think about being a mother and, managing being self-employed. And what I also did at the time was did some freelance work. And I think that was really important for me in the first 2 years of being self-employed, is I utilized my skills before. So my background is all around program management, project management, and I was able to work with an agency which worked with lots of different big clients in a multitude of different industries that I never worked with before. So tech, pharma companies, media companies, marketing agencies, and as well as kind of building my coaching business, I also did some freelance work for them. And that was really exciting. And that definitely worked well because it meant that I had a bit more of a steady income as I was building my coaching business, and then allowed me to evolve as things kind of continued and grew.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think a lot of people will think about, well, I think a lot of people will resonate, firstly, a lot of women with, the move to becoming self-employed as an element of having that extra flexibility, so that you can have that extra time if you need and you want to. And I think a lot of people do that around that similar life change. So it'll probably resonate a lot with other people. But basically, everyone just save up a bit of cash. So you've got a bit of a buffer. And I think giving yourself a timeline on whether it works or not within 2 years is a very clever idea. Otherwise, you can see yourself just keep trying and trying, rinsing through savings. And if things don't work out, then you'll probably affect your confidence as well. So just having that time stamp of like, okay, let's give it a whirl and then let's review, see how we're getting on. And if it's going great, obviously continue. And if it's not, then you still know that you have those additional skills to take back to an employer should you wish to do that again. So I think that's valuable advice, definitely.
And just on that point, it's around constantly iterating, because I look at my business when I became self-employed for the first time versus now. Like, I was like completely direct client focused, so B2C, whereas now I'd say 99% of B2B, and that was all through kind of feedback and testing and learning. And again, you might have a great product, but actually it might not be right for the marketplace at all or at that time. So it's how do you also adapt and evolve. And I think that for me is one of the most exciting things of being a business owner, that I don't know what my business will look like in the next 5 years. And for someone that is a planner and likes to have control and stuff like that, that is actually really exciting, because who knows, it's about being open to opportunities.
Absolutely. So on that note, actually, how did you adapt and evolve from going from B2C to B2B? Because that is quite a shift. How did you go through the process, or what process did you have to identify that feedback?
So I think I shied away from B2B because of my corporate experience. And it wasn't because my corporate experience was bad. I just feel like I needed that really hard stop and hard break of like something completely different. And it came around quite serendipitously, where I was chatting to someone about something completely different. And they were like, oh, I'm also the head of learning development at London University. And we're actually looking to bring someone in externally to deliver a program for our female staff. And actually what you've been talking about around your group coaching program, obviously we'd have to adapt it slightly because we don't want people to leave, but actually around some of the kind of principles around supporting women to gain in confidence, getting really clear on career goals, thinking about networking, thinking about mentoring, thinking about communication, putting themselves forward. Those are things that have actually been identified as part of our employee pulse surveys that we want to focus on. Is this something that you'd be interested in? And I was like, yeah, I'd give that a go. And it's funny, I don't think those moments happen, but they probably happen like more so than I thought. And that was a real shift for me in mindset, and it took years to actually come into fruition. But that was me thinking about, well, actually, there is a huge amount of applicability. So then my business basically shifted to being like, right, how can I drive more gender equity in the workplace? And that felt like a really good development, because I am super passionate. Even now, I am super passionate around more women in leadership positions. Like, how can we change the world? Like, actually, you know, equality and equity is the way forward. You know, there's so much data to back that up. And that is something that actually, being, you know, a senior female leader in a very male dominated environment, and all of my experience, I was very well placed to lead those conversations. And then it has since evolved to being about, actually, it's not always up to women to change the landscape. You know, we as women can do our own work to change our levels of confidence and can equip ourselves with skills. But actually, there needs to be much broader workplace changes and even kind of systemic changes. So how things have evolved, particularly over the last, I'd say, year to 18 months, is actually, it's more around, how do we create that really positive people first work culture that allows everyone, including women, to really feel that level of inclusion, feel that level of belonging, for diverse viewpoints to be considered. And then how do we give people what they need in order to get that level of equality? And I feel that, particularly in the companies and organizations that I'm working with now, we are having a huge impact. So I'm working with, you know, real senior leadership teams, and they are then cascading down that messaging to their teams to really drive those big shifts in workplace culture, which again takes time, but there are some quick wins that we're able to implement that are really changing how it feels for individuals to turn up to work, because it's important.
I love that. So for anybody listening that might be, for example, a leader, they might be working the people function, and they've been tasked, or they've been thinking about how they can shift the needle or help with anything regards to equity, gender equity, diversity, inclusion. I know this is a huge question, but what tips, like if you could give 3 top tips to somebody who's in that capacity to improve and shift the needle on that, what would you say?
So I feel that there has been a huge amount of shifts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, even in the last 4 years, when we think about kind of the rise of Black Lives Matter, and we saw with a lot of the big global companies the setting up of DEI divisions with chief diversity officers, and then what we've seen since that, and again, there's a multitude of reasons which I won't go into in terms of why that has been, but even in the last couple of years, what we're seeing, and most recently in the last couple of months with Microsoft disbanding their team, is, I don't think it's because there isn't enough focus on DEI. I feel like there's a lack of tangibility, and having it as a separate function even more reinforces the kind of otherness of this. So the advice, and again, this is kind of chunky advice, is thinking about, how can organizations, and even how can teams and leaders, how can you embed diversity, equity, inclusion in everything you do? And even taking it down to the leader level and kind of the sphere of control that lots of people listening to this will have. How can you make sure that you have systems and processes in place, that you are bringing people together and listening to every single voice, and making sure that the people in your team feel really valued and know the skills, and feel empowered to bring those skills and those viewpoints, and to make sure that actually conflict isn't avoided, that you're encouraging conflict, and actually it's all about healthy conflict. So how can you disagree, and sometimes adamantly disagree with each other, but how can you end the meeting or end the session coming to some form of solution on the path forward? And how do you test and learn, and how do you iterate? So instead of thinking about, well, actually, no, you know, the senior leadership team need to do things differently, and the workplace needs to change, and the system needs to change, and society needs to change, it's really honing in on, as a leader within an organization, or even as an individual, what is the impact and what is the change that I can drive? And there is so much value in impact. And actually, what you see, even in really toxic workplaces, a good leader can really shade their team from a lot of that toxicity. Like, good leaders and authentic leaders and inspirational leaders are important now more than ever. And it's focusing on what are the small little things that you can do, testing that, involving teams in decision making, getting feedback that can then really change the things. And you can iterate. And those are small things that you can enact after listening to this podcast.
I love that. Brilliant. And so if anyone, I mean, obviously people will probably want to reach out to you after this podcast, at least I like to think so. So how can people find you?
So I've got a website, www.emilybuttoncoaching.com, and then I'm also on LinkedIn, Emily Button Lynham, and I'd love to chat to anyone that has any questions or would like to expand on anything that I've covered today.
I love that. And I've got a few final questions for you. So what is one non-career related thing that you think has positively influenced your career to date?
For me, I think it's been around habits, and it's been around identifying what are the habits that I need to prioritize in my life that makes me a better human. So at the moment, I'm really focused on morning routines and evening routines, which again has been a bit of a process with having like 2 young kids. But actually, it's around understanding, how do I be my best self? And for me, it's around making sure that I'm blocking out time to be by myself, which again can be quite tricky. It's around meditating, it's around getting outside. So it's the small little things rather than the big kind of like, oh, I need to go away to the Maldives for a week, which would be great in an ideal world, but isn't going to happen. It's around what are the small, like, mindful moments that I can bring into my day. And that has been a real goal and has been really challenging, but I've definitely reaped the benefits personally and even professionally with that.
I love that. And so just touching on obviously trends in your field. So are there any particular trends that you've seen maybe, or you can predict in the next couple of years within DEI space, or anything like any coaching or leadership coaching or training that you do?
I think the future of work is quite a broad theme, and I think it's really interesting how that will pan out. Like, you touched upon hybrid working and remote working, and actually when you look at a lot of companies that are bringing, big companies, Boots, JD Sports, etc., that are bringing people back into the workplace, you're still seeing from a individual standpoint, and you'll be seeing this from with your recruitment lens, actually that it's really needed. Like, people want to be able to work from a hybrid perspective. So I'm really interested to see how that will kind of pan out, and also how training can be done in a more hybrid basis. How do you make sure that you're supporting people? And I think it's further understanding, as we get different generations in the workplace, how as a leader do you best support them? So as of next year, millennials will be the dominant generation in the workplace, but we've got 5 demographics. So it's challenging as a leader. And I think that there'll be there'll continue to be change from a macro perspective. If we think about even politically, I think half the world are eligible to vote this year. So who knows what kind of world we'll be going into from a 2025 perspective. But there's always going to be that change, and there's always going to be change in organizations which are going to reflect what's happening from a macro environment. So actually, I think there's going to be much more focus on how do organizations equip leaders to manage change and uncertainty. And I think that is going to continue to be a big topic over the next couple of years.
I totally and wholeheartedly agree. I think that we're going through a bit of a revolution with regards to the workplace revolution, because if you look back at like the Industrial Revolution, etc., we are going through such a moment of change, and we're living and breathing through it, as people would have done back in the Industrial Revolution, but you don't really realize it's happening at the time because it's like a slower process. But right now there is so much shifting. I even saw an article earlier today citing that in 2050, I don't quote me on the year, but essentially the 9 to 5 is dead, or it will be dead. And there's also a huge shift of people becoming freelancers, having multi-faceted careers, or multi-hyphen careers, let's say, as well, so that they're not just focusing on one income stream, and there becomes a whole cultural shift around that as well. So there is so much happening in the world at the moment, and like you said, it will be very interesting to see what a place looks like even in 5 years time. Honestly, there's so much change happening at the moment. It is absolutely wild. Okay, perfect. So obviously you're very much in touch with all things career, leadership, etc. What podcast could you recommend, or are you following at the moment?
I have a love-hate relationship with Stephen Bartlett. I won't go into why, but he has some interesting guests, so it's a bit clickbaity. But actually, I've been listening to some interesting podcasts all around, I guess, more kind of psychology based. And that's been super interesting. And Bruce Daisley does a really interesting podcast around culture, and there's some sales podcasts that I listen to as well, because sales is not my strong point, but something that as a CEO I have to do. So lots of research around that.
I love that. I don't often hear people say that they are listening to podcasts to like level up on different skills that they have, but surprisingly it's like the easiest form of content to consume, and
definitely
people just don't do it enough. So I love that. Brilliant. So Emily, you've provided so many wonderful insights, and I think that you've brought up a lot of very interesting conversations, and I think we could have a podcast on each different thing. There's so much to unpack with what you do, but I think it has been very insightful, so thank you very much for coming on today. And if anyone wants to reach out to Emily, all her details will be in the show notes, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.